All right, Streamline database deployments. I don't know about the rest of y'all, but I've been on some deployments that have seemingly taken for hours, and I got to the point that sometimes I was the one taking a long time to do the deployments. So I started trying to figure out different ways that I could make my life easier, because that's really what I wanted. I wanted not to be up all night. So let's see here. My screens are separated, so let's see. Nope. Let me try to reshare again. Well, this clicks out. It's like you could see it and then you couldn't. Don't look at my documents folder, it's a mess. Occupational hazard, in my opinion, of being a DBA. My file structure's a little scary. Okay, here we go. So, my name is Elizabeth Noble. My pronouns are she, and I'm not even going to pronounce it correctly, Z. My email address is elizabeth.a.noble@outlook.com. If you have any questions after this presentation, if you're interested in setting up automated deployment, CI/CD with databases, please reach out if you have questions. I'm more than happy to help. I really want everybody to be able to have the joy of not having deployments that take forever and seem super stressful, because when I first started, I thought like database deployments were going to be super exciting and I was going to do all this cool, fun stuff. And, here I am 6 years later. And if the deployment takes longer than an hour and a half, I usually feel like it's been far too long. And if you'd like, you can follow me on Twitter. I tweet about CI/CD, databases, Huskies, wolves, various other topics. And I also am a Microsoft MVP, but I haven't updated that. It's been about 6 months now. And I've known Tracy. She was kind of going back to Tracy. She was the first female speaker that I really interacted with. My first event speaking at a SQL Saturday. I was super nervous and she walked up to me and was just like, yay, another female speaker. And I was kind of like, who is this woman just walking up saying hi to me? Because I'm a little shy. But she has turned out to be just as friendly as she was that day. So she's a great person. So if you're in the same sort of situation I was in prior to my life now, which is what I'm going to call deployments now, like before you've changed, right? Before you've changed your process. So for me, this whole process started a couple years ago. We came up with a new piece of software, and it's a point of sale piece of software that was built in-house. And we did all of our deployments, all of our scripts were in Jira, and they were all on separate user stories. They had rollback scripts, but there was no sort of change management, change tracking, none of that. So a lot of times when it was deployment time, I'd have to go find all the Jira user stories and download all the scripts and then re-upload them to a page. And because the company I work for is called Pull Apart, and they have 25 retail stores. They are a brand themselves as a do-it-yourself used auto parts company. They are also tied into the vehicle recycling aspect of things. So after people buy parts off of the cars, they get recycled. But we had 25 stores and we were deploying our point of sale system to all of those stores. And because of like how critical a point of sale system is, we did not deploy it to every single store. So we had like a 4 to 6 month long deployment process. So not only did we have the scripts from the first deployment, but we had every change script that happened after that. So I was oftentimes up late at night trying to figure out what the right version of code was. It wasn't really centrally managed other than what I had kind of thrown together. And so I'm sitting there doing like, Redgate schema compares between two different servers, an old server and a new server, to make sure I have deployed, generally the same code. But then, oh wait, we made some, updates, so those all have to be deployed. And so it was a lot of stress and a lot of tension. I was up late at night. It was super bad for, my mental health and self-care and all of that. And unfortunately, none of that was rewarded the next day, usually after a long night of having watching everybody watch me run scripts and worrying about deploying the wrong version of the cashier system. The next day we'd come in and things would be broken and we'd be having meetings or we'd be rolling things back, we'd be doing bug fixes. So it was kind of this never ending process of just being stressed all the time. And for me, and I think it's a pretty common thread with data professionals, is that I think part of the reason we do what we do is because we care about the data, we care about, you know, the quality of work. We want to make sure that things are functioning optimally. That's why I became a database administrator, is because I wanted to have somebody be an advocate for the database. And so when I'm tired and stressed out and you know, not giving my best, and then having things go wrong, I feel like I'm the one messing up. And that ultimately for me led to a fairly decent period of burnout as a result of that. And so I kind of started getting this perspective of like, this can't be the way that this is for everybody. Like this is unmanageable. And the other things I started realizing or started feeling like is, you know, there were times, and I've had this happen at other companies as well, where, you know, you deploy one version of the software and something gets fixed, and then you go back the next deployment and it's undone, or you don't know how that one stored procedure ended up out there. And so it kind of gave me that like weird feeling of like, I didn't feel comfortable with what was happening in the system. It seemed like everything was changing around me, and sometimes I didn't even know why or what it was changing. And so I kind of took some analysis to figure out, how is that happening? Why is that happening? And so that kind of led me down this path of reasons that this is happening. And thankfully at one of the companies I was at, the development team had spent a pretty lengthy time explaining to non-developers, you know, their process of how a bug would be fixed in one sprint and then broken in the next release. And so that did help me have some context. And so I kind of realized that I could have changes because of how I'm deploying my code, how I'm putting things out there, how I'm bundling my changes. The other thing is, it could be how I'm managing my code. And those seem like two similar concepts, but they're very different. And in a lot of ways, the reason I start with how you deploy your code is there's two main ways to deploy code for SQL Server. And the main way of deploying code is actually going to determine how you save your code, how you store your code, how you write your code to a certain extent. So the first step you kind of have to figure out is, how do you want to deploy your code? What will work for your business? What are you comfortable with? Now, I tend to be a little, I want everybody to get along. I want peace and harmony. So in some ways, I tend to be a bit more flexible than other individuals, and you got to find your own way. But one of the things I chose when focusing on deploying my code was I wanted to focus on deploying code that matched how our applications are being deployed, because I wanted, since my team didn't write all the database code, I wanted something that the developers would embrace as well. And as far as managing code, I kind of realized that would kind of fall in line to a certain extent with once we determined how we deployed our code. So to give a brief overview of managing deployments, and I promise I do have some demos in here as well. So what we're really trying to solve are, why is my code getting overwritten? What happens if I deploy code to production and it isn't in, you know, for me, source control? And I will say that's kind of the first step of this, which you still kind of have to back into, but the first step of this is acknowledging that a version control or source control system is going to be helpful, and that you're not going to have to try to manage these files in different folders and kind of get that sort of habit, because it's the advantage of getting a continuous integration sort of system set up is that it really gets you comfortable with not having your hands doing everything. And once you get that confidence, it's really helpful. But that's what you're trying to address. You're trying to address, why are things getting overwritten? Why are things ending up in production that shouldn't be there? Or why are they sitting in production when you don't expect them to? I know we all want to live in a happy world where people don't have access to production, that aren't going to treat it well. At my company, the developers do have access to production, and everybody used to have the SA password. So you kind of had to deal with things in a way of, well, I don't know if somebody's going to go change that. And so that was one of the thought processes that we had to have when we were coming up with our deployment method. And so when you're talking about how to deploy your code, there's two ways, or there's two sides of deploying code, right? There's the code that you've written, and you can kind of bundle that all together and say, well, this is the new code I've written, for the last 2 weeks or whatever, and this is what I'm going to deploy. Or you can say, I know exactly what my database should look like in terms of all the tables and all the stored procedures and all the other database objects in it. And I want my deployment to match that whole database schema. And those are kind of your two levers. You get one or the other. And you can do hybrid to a certain extent, but you can't mix, you can't take 50% of one and 70% of the other unless that's built into your whole process. So the best bet is to pick one main method. And if that main method won't handle everything for you, then you use the second method for the additional pieces that you need. So I want to walk through kind of visually what a migration-based deployment is. And a migration-based deployment is really what I think most DBAs are the most comfortable and familiar with. These are usually the deployments where you have, on this user story, there's one script file, I run the script file and it's deployed. I'm only deploying the new work that was created. So in this diagram, the little purple file represents the new script file. And what's going to happen is I'm going to run that on my development environment. What it's going to do is it's going to change my development database to be purple to represent that script has been deployed. And then when I'm ready to go to production, I'll just run that script again. And then in production, it will then match development. And that's great. The challenge is when it's not this situation, right? So let's say we have we have a hot fix. And so even before we have the hot fix, we do some development work, we deploy that script to the development environment. The database and development is purple, indicating the script has been deployed. Now, if you do a hot fix in production and you just deploy that script to production, the production database I've made gray to kind of indicate it's in a different state. It's got a different schema than the development environment. And then when you do your deployment, if you then deploy your development script to production, it's going to deploy. But if it's a different database object, it's going to leave your database in what I've colored lavender to indicate a different state. It doesn't match either production from before the deployment, nor does it match dev. And so now you've got this discrepancy between your two deployments. Now, this can definitely be solved by, making sure that you run your hot fixes in your lower environments, which is one of the things that we've implemented just as a general process, is that if we need to do a hot fix, we will deploy the hot fix to production if it's that urgent. If it's not that urgent, we will actually deploy the hot fix to dev, QA, staging, and production, all back to back, so that we at least know that fix has been deployed everywhere. But what I'm trying to show here is that if you don't have that discipline and you don't have that process, a migration-based deployment method can leave your databases out of sync. And it's going to be hard to identify those, particularly if you don't have good controls over who has access to the database or good monitoring over who's been running things. And with that, I'm going to start on a demo of the migration-based deployment. So I've got Visual Studio, and I will say there are various tools you can use for your migration-based deployments. I believe that Redgate has a tool, and I believe it is built off of DBUp, but DBUp is the free version, and I will say it's probably even a little more codey, and I'm not a code person. I came from business operations prior to becoming a database administrator, so I'm not a former software developer or systems administrator. Oop, there we go. I'm trying to see. I thought I was gonna be smart with the zoom it, and it's like no. So we'll just roll with it. So what you've got for the migration based is the C# program, and there's some documentation to kind of walk you through how to set this up. And I can definitely find those links. I don't think I have them at the end of this presentation. And it's one of those, like, for real, I copy and pasted it. I think the source was pretty credible, like it was like DBUp's site or something like that. It wasn't anything too far off. But it's designed to be pretty easy to use. And so the concept is that if you need to make a new file, if you need to make a new script, right? And so one of the nice things about this, I will say, is that these script files, I mean, you can use them to create tables, you can use them to insert data, delete data, update data, make views, modify all sorts of stuff, right? So it can handle data modification and data definition type stuff. And it can do them both. And that's, I would say, the biggest benefit of it is that if you tend to have an environment where you do tend to change a lot of the data as part of a deployment, this could be very helpful. So you just go through this process of adding a new item. And then you number it. And a lot of times you're going to number it more because if you have multiple items you're working on, you want to be able to indicate what order the migration-based scripts are going to be deployed in. And I think that's kind of the key thing to consider when you're working with these migration-based scripts, is that it's all deployed in order. So, you know, if you had 3 different user stories working on the same table or same stored procedure, let's say, and it had 3 different changes, individuals would have to know to grab the most recent version of that stored procedure that had either been deployed or was already in source control, because nothing would really, in my experience, figure out how to say those 3 things had changed, particularly if you're all working on the same branch, which within GitHub, which we'll get to a little bit later. The other thing that you need to do when you're using DBUp is you need to change it to an embedded resource. And that's just so that DBUp knows how to treat this file as part of its process. So I'm just going to make a really generic table. And before we go to implement that, I'm going to go to my database, and I'm using the forecast migration, and I'm reading it out loud because I know it's probably, the font's probably a little small. I'm using the forecast migration database, and I'm checking to see if I have a table called MIGR for migration test, and I do not see a file there. So I've got Albany, new table test, payment test, test to vendor, and vendor payment. The table that stands out is this schema versions table, and this is actually how DBUp keeps track of what it's deployed. So if we go back to the source control, you see we've deployed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Like, those are the different script files. They all begin with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And if I query this schema versions table, I'm going to try this again. Nope. I'll read these to you. I've got script names beginning with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I've got some other 4, 5, 6 scripts because of different branches. But there is no script 7 that's been deployed. So there's no record in this table of the script being deployed, nor does the table currently exist in the database. So now that I've made this table, I can go over and I can save my changes. I should have saved everything first, so let me do that. And we'll build it. All right, so the build's good, and then we'll go back and so this is where if you haven't done continuous integration, this is going to feel a bit like database magic, which is kind of cool and exciting and also a little nerve-wracking. So I'm inside of Azure DevOps, which this is completely free. Like I haven't paid for any of this. And to be honest, my company for a long time was using a free version of Azure DevOps as well. I think the paid versions kind of control like how many builds you can have running at once, what the total build times per month are, that kind of stuff. So what I've done inside of Azure DevOps is I've built this pipeline, and I will say, I will show you the pipeline code. It is using YAML. It is not my ideal like tool. Like it's pretty much, I've gotten to the point that I'm comfortable with it and I copy and paste it as I need it. So we've got, it's accessing the solution file, and then it's going to basically take items out of the solution file and save those files somewhere else. And that's because I've got a separate pipeline that's going to do a build or a release. And what the release is going to do is it's currently configured. It says unit testing, but I'll show you all those unit testing tasks are disabled right now. It's going to deploy the database. And so it's got some of this configuration stuff where I specify database deployment and that I'm using a DAC pack, which is a database tier application. And I'm going to use the server name, and there's the database name that I'm going to deploy to, but I've hard coded it to use I'm in the wrong one. That's why. I'm gonna go forecast migration. There we go, much better. So this one is forecast migration. You can, or DB up, and you can see that it actually just deployed just now and took 1 minute and 18 seconds. And if I go to the YAML should look pretty similar, except it wants me to re-sign into GitHub because apparently it's been a while. And hopefully it does not error out of me. Sometimes GitHub gets a little funky with me and it wants me to log in several times. So once again, it's still running, it's still building that solution file. And then it's got these build and test tasks that I put in there because I've been trying to automate unit testing. But down here is where it's copying the file. And then if I go to the releases, it's actually in the process of working through the release right now. And if you're using Teams, you can actually connect Teams to Azure DevOps and have some dashboards set up that way. I haven't gotten to the point that I've like set up Teams alerts for failures, probably because I'm not responsible for all the development, so I kind of let the developers handle what they're working on. But if I go into this release pipeline, it's got its deployment task, same sort of thing, but you see it says DB up migration. And then I've specified, and I'm gonna have to change that password after this recording. I've specified some information on how to connect to that database and where the script files are. And so if we go back to the pipeline, we should eventually see that it's successful. It's been taking a little while today. And if we're curious why, we can dig into it. It looks like it's taking a while to download the artifact. And if you're curious, like how long it took in the past, I can go back to the deployments and it should tell me how long this deployment took. Didn't take too long, it looks like. So what this is trying to do right now is it's trying to take those script files and download them to this machine. And how I did that is I had to go to the deployment group. And inside the deployment group, if I click on all of this, there's a bunch of PowerShell code that needs to be run. And just like that password that I had that I'll need to go change, the PowerShell stuff is like pretty specific. So you don't really want to go necessarily sharing that, but it'll give you the code and it tells you to go run it as an administrator, so that essentially so that Azure DevOps can connect to your machine. So you don't have to have a machine in the cloud to use Azure DevOps and to do your deployments through Azure DevOps. You can deploy to your machines on your premises. So now if I go back here and I refresh my tables, I should see, yep, that I have this migration test table. So I didn't actually run any code. Azure DevOps did all that for me. And I will say, if you've had challenges with your developers in terms of script reviews and frustration on that end, I've found that if you can get like the build process, because the normal like SQL Server data tools build can catch a lot of errors. If the build process tells them there's a problem, it's a lot less contentious, right? It's the computer, it's the machine that told them to fix something. And sometimes that does make that whole dialogue a little easier. And if I go ahead and rerun my query, I'm going to see that this last line right here is the script 07 migration test. So that is our demo for the migration-based deployments. Before I go any further, are there any questions?
So I'm guessing what you're saying at this point is developers are able to, by the continuous integration, they can commit code, sync it up, and it's just going to be going as a release. Or are you able to plan a release for certain times? Or is that just?
You can. The way we did ours, so I'll be full disclosure, we use Octopus Deploy, which I do find more intuitive. So we let our developers deploy code to development all the time, whenever they want. And I'll admit, it does step on each other's code. And honestly, if we could get to containers, that'd be awesome. But everything else in our environment is gated. So that first release that builds goes to development, and then QA decides when to take that same like release information and put that into a separate environment. And you can build it out. Let me go back to see if I can get back to the screen. You can add other environments to Azure DevOps. I just haven't built that out yet. So the concept is those stages, is that these stages is that you should be able to add new stages and control how those stages get kicked off.
Okay.
Whether they're manual or automated. So you don't have to have your developers deploying everything to production immediately. That's fine. Because yeah, good. we do script reviews, we do QA controls when they deploy, we do a store zero deployment, which is actually where we merge all of our code back together. So that's really the first time that we see that all of our code will work together. And then and for a long time we would do another script review, like because we do state-based. We do another like comparison of what was being deployed in our UAT environment and then in our production environment, even before we said you can deploy to production. And I think after we've done that for like 3 years, we've now gotten comfortable enough that we'll still do the review in UAT, but when we get to production, we just let it go. But yeah, we still schedule all those deployments, which is why we're not quite continuous delivery.
Right.
Yep. Anything else? Okay. Moving on. All right. So my favorite, so I will admit I'm completely biased, is the state-based deployment. And the reason that I like the state-based deployment is the term we used when we were discussing it internally is that it will stomp all over what is currently in your environment. And we kind of use that terminology because we wanted developers to know if you put something somewhere and you don't clean it up, it's going to get overwritten. And don't be upset at us if we overwrite your code, because that's just how it's going to be. And so what happens with a state-based, and it's not quite as accurate is you'll take that script file, and you're honestly usually going to save that script file into something, into a version control system. But when you deploy that script file and it goes to the database, once again, it's going to make that database purple to reflect the script has been deployed. But what happens is when you do your deployments, the big difference between a migration-based and a state-based is a state-based deployment. When it does the migration, it's going to look at these two databases, right? We have the purple one on the left and the white one on the right, and it's gonna say what's different between these two. So even if technically only 3 stored procedures should have changed in a sprint, if somebody dropped a table in production, or depending on your configuration, added something to production, theoretically, once the state-based deployment is done, that extra item is going to be gone. That dropped item is going to be put back into place. It's all going to be put back to what's in your source control, with the big caveat that there are lots of ways to control how your source control interacts with your databases. Almost a confusing amount. But if we do our deployment, I kind of signified the state-based by essentially taking that database, and that's going to represent the database schema. And that database schema is then going to be overlapped. And what this is going to functionally operate a lot like is it's going to operate like Redgate's schema compare. It's generally the same thing. If you look at the code, it doesn't look too terribly different. And to me, it's nice because we've been using it, I think, for 5 or 6 years now. It does a great job managing what order things need to be deployed in, so you don't have to get caught on the fact that, user story 12 was done after user story 15, but it needs to be deployed before 15 because of the way that, like one depends on a table and one depends on a stored procedure. This one's smart enough to kind of put all that together. The other reason that we've enjoyed it at my company is because since it's schema-based, our developers no longer have to write rollback scripts, because we used to make them write rollback scripts for everything. And now that they don't have to write rollback scripts, but we can still roll back things, it's very helpful. The parts where the state-based deployment struggles is if you need to update data tables, if you need to modify data. It's got a pre and a post deployment script, but you only get one per database, which if you try to think about how many things you'd want to manage over time, that can get really cumbersome. Which is why I've been leaning towards that hybrid approach, where leaning towards implementing migration-based for the data updates, and then state-based for the database objects. And then to give a fair comparison of how the hotfix would work is we'd have the script file. Once again, the purple script file get deployed to the development environment. That database would be purple. You could deploy your hotfix to production, but if you didn't check it into source control, you've got it gray because it indicates the hotfix has been deployed. But once you do your production deployment, it's just going to potentially overwrite that hotfix. And so that's one of those, be aware of how you do things, right? Is if that's not going to work for your business, then state-based probably isn't the choice for you. But if you like the fact that people are going to have to get in the habit of keeping things up to date, then that may be something you want to consider. The thing I've found with source control, my tongue-in-cheek joke about it is, it's really easy to get a database in source control. It's very hard to keep it in source control. So what I've found personally is that if you have a database in source control and you don't have a way to deploy it, the database source control gets out of sync with production very quickly. So it's almost because we put all of our databases in source control. It's one of my favorite stories. We put all of our databases in source control because I went to one of the developers, the lead developer, and I said, hey, I've been thinking about putting the databases in source control, but I'm not really sure where to get started. And he comes back in the following Monday and he goes, I got the databases in source control for you, which was great. First of all, it was like, wow, I didn't even need to ask anybody to do anything. And they just, he just did everything for me. But we didn't have a way to deploy the code. So what happened in 2 months is that the developers were still writing their scripts and still attaching them to the Jira user stories. Nobody was updating what was in source control. And so then source control became completely useless because it was completely out of sync. So I would say if you're thinking about source control and you've had trouble implementing it, I would highly recommend considering what your deployment process is going to be before trying to re-implement it again. And with that, I'm going to give you a demo on state-based deployments. State-based deployments use SQL Server data tools, which is free. And I will say I have had excellent luck with it. I know other people have not. However, we just recently implemented replication. And I think it's been, particularly for me, a huge learning lesson in how certain changes to a database can affect database objects, right? So like if you add replication, what I did not know before the last couple of months is that it adds like this not for replication qualifier to your tables that are being replicated that have identity columns. And since that wasn't in source control, every time our automated process would try to run, it would try to undo all of the things that we had deployed for replication. And so we ended up with, I think, 3 different main branches that essentially weren't able to deploy until I created, I basically created this branch just to sync our source control up with replication. And if I had known in advance that, that's how replication was going to work, I would have handled it differently. I honestly would have implemented the changes to the tables first, made sure that was deployed everywhere, and then deployed replication so that all the source control, everything that people were working off of had all the information that they needed. So this is SQL Server Data Tools. I really like the fact that it's very well organized. It's easy to set up. You should be able to, you can just import. It won't give me the option because I've already have it set up, but you can import from a database. So you can, that's why it's easy to get it into source control, is that you can right click on it. You can say import, and then connect to my database. And what it's going to do is it's going to make all these file folders. So this is the schema file folder. So if you have only DBO, everything's going to be in DBO. But if you have DBO and you have other schemas, it's going to make all those schema folders. And then inside of each schema folder, it's going to very nicely group stored procedures and tables, which my sense of humor says that gets rid of part of the whole conversation about views. Obviously, there's lots of conversations about views, but at least the one about I can't tell what's a view and what's a table, pretty easily handled this way. Now, I will say in my experience, after you've set this up automatically, you have to kind of understand how things are filed, and you have to get in a good practice of making sure that you create those items in the correct buckets. Not because the deployment process will break, but because as a person, it gets harder to keep track of things if you're not putting things in the right places. And then security tends to have schema definitions. If you want users and logins, you can put them in there. I think we personally found that to be way too cumbersome and way too tedious. It also allows for variables in here. So if you have cross database references, it can be handled with variables as long as both databases don't reference one another. It can handle environmental variables in your code. So, say that, something needs to call, a URL or something, and the URL is different between environments. You can have something that populates a variable in there. So that there is some functionality that's very flexible. And then this unit testing aspect isn't part of this session, but I've done a previous session on how to use T-SQL-T for unit testing. And so that's what that section is my unit testing area. The other part that's pretty nice, if I wanted to change something, and this one may be a bit, I may break some of this, so let me make it not too difficult. This is, by breaking it, I'm saying that there is, I don't have it here, but there's something called a publish profile. And the publish profile, let's see here. The publish profile is where you can control everything. And I would say, definitely test that in your development environment. It's got things like, so the blocking incremental block incremental deployment if data loss might occur. That's one we had in place for a long, long time. And that's why I was hesitating about changing like the varchar 100 to a varchar 10, because if there's data in the table that's being referenced, it could basically cause issues with the table, and it would fail, which is exactly what you want it to do. So there is a lot of control. There's always recreate databases. I had this selected on accident the first time I was doing all this stuff, which means it drops your database. Yeah, don't do that one unless you really, really want to. Just don't be surprised. So the publish profile is kind of how you can control what's happening. Same sort of process in terms of changes. I can add my notes. It's just all right, and then we'll send this one up. And this is going to look functionally the same. It's going to have a pipeline. The pipeline's going to do some stuff, and then it's going to go to the release pipeline. So the YAML behind how these got created is different. Should be running soon. There we go. I've found on Azure DevOps, in particular with the free one, that sometimes it seems slow, and it's more like I think it is tied to the free aspect of it less than the tool not doing what you need. So like it's telling me that I'm waiting on something, but I'm not running anything, so I'm in a queue somewhere. And when you design all your code with that YAML file that I was showing you earlier, one of the other nice features is it gives you like step-by-step. So as it goes through each step of the YAML file, you can see that it was initializing the job, and it's got a build step and a copy step. And so, those days where, you're having a bad day and you can't wait to see something succeed, this is a great thing to go look at if you know your build's going to work, because you get a lot of happy green checkboxes at the end. And I think last time it said it took, should be click, not there. If you click here, you've got your history. And so last time it took 1 minute and 47 seconds. So it should take about 2 minutes for that whole build process to run. My long-term goal is to figure out where and how to get like all those coding standards that we have. There's a way to essentially use static code analysis to have like these automated systems make sure that like people didn't, they're not using select all, or they're not using, SP underscore for their stored procedure name. And there's ways to integrate SQL cop and all of that into these automated processes. And as I said, I've personally found that if these processes are automated well enough, that the developer gets the feedback from the automated process, and then I'm not the bad guy anymore, which makes my life a lot easier. I have other things to do besides worrying about being the bad guy. And then the other things I've found is if you're using Jira, there's a way to integrate GitHub, Azure DevOps into, I think Azure DevOps, we integrated Octopus Deploy, but there's a way to get things integrated so that you can even see on your Jira user stories what branches people are using.
So we had a question pop up that says, do you have a T-SQL style guide?
I do not. I wish I did. If they have one, send it to me. I'd love to have one. I feel like that takes a lot of time to get set up. And I don't know about the rest of you all. My company operates pretty lean. So I normally do things in like 5-minute increments. So if I can't find 5 to 10 minutes to get something set up, then it doesn't happen. I've also heard that Redgate, I think Rob Volk told me, Redgate SQL prompt, there's a way to configure SQL prompts where when you check out code, it converts the code into the format that you prefer to work with. And when you check in the code, it checks the code in the company format. And I probably need to ask him more questions about that, because if that is true, that would be amazing. Because my style of code, I've gotten picked on quite a bit about my style of code. I don't like, I think back from like old school, like not having big computer monitors. I don't like having my code go across very far usually. So I normally won't do it, but obviously, as you can tell with that insert statement, I'm not exactly super specific about it.
And just so you're aware, somebody did post a free style guide.
Well, they are my hero. I'll make sure to get that. I'll pick that up on my way out.
All right.
Excellent. The good news is most of the time I don't have to watch this stuff build. I do pay attention to my builds. I would say don't be the person that checks in your code. And we had a developer do this, and he has thankfully stopped. He's a really good developer, but I'm so glad he stopped doing this, because he would check in his code at the end of the day and then leave for the day before it finished building and deploying. And I worked with somebody that worked at a company that did like the continuous integration, continuous delivery, like all the time, right? And so they had a big thing about what's called don't break the build. And they would make sure to like, publicly point out people that had broken the build in an effort to get them to not do that. I'm a bit nicer. So this will take a few minutes. And I did test this, so I know the overall deployment will work. But while that's running, let's go look at that stored procedure, just so I can show you that it for real is going to change. Assuming it's like not going to finish while I'm looking at it. Now it's still downloading the artifact. I'm now scared like my internet just cut out. That happened before we all started talking. Okay, stored procedures. It must be doing something. Yep. So it's doing the deploy. And I will say one of the things that makes a lot of database administrators nervous is not seeing the code that's being deployed. So one of the things that we did is we're using essentially SQL package.exe. There's a way to run SQL package.exe and have it spit out a script file essentially of what it's going to run. And so when we set up Octopus Deploy, there's actually one step that spits out the script file, and then the next step that deploys the code, so that when we go back to a release, we can see exactly what the automated process was trying to deploy in case there are any concerns. So with this method, the scariest thing about this method was actually the first deployment, because the first deployment, you don't really have an undo button, right? You can make a snapshot and a backup, but that's really all you have. Once you get that first deployment underway and you're confident that the first deployment is good, which is why I think we took a 2-week sprint to get it set up, which was, I'm sure, as you can imagine, a little not the most popular concept all around, but all the development teams were on board. Management wasn't as excited. But we took a 2-week sprint to get it all set up and get it deployed so that we knew this is the version of the database code that works, that we, that if we have to go back to a version, this version's okay. And then once you are like, the nice part is once you have that set up once, and then you just keep track of, your last known good deployment, you can go ahead and work with that. For us, we've kind of adopted a strategy of roll forward versus roll back. So that's what we've focused on. All right, so here is my stored procedure. And this is on my local machine, so I'm really super happy to see that it's slow. I probably don't have memory set correctly on my computer is what I'm gonna guess. Just gonna think about it. See, it's always fun when the deployment part goes faster than the opening up the file in SQL Server. The other thing I've been working on recently, which I do have a series of YouTube videos on, is one of the concerns that a lot of database administrators brought up to me, or at least a few, was I don't want to do my software development or my database development inside of Visual Studio. So I've been focusing a series of YouTube videos on how to use SQL Server data tools inside of Azure Data Studio. And I will say it's not as full featured as Visual Studio. For instance, last I checked, you still couldn't create a publish profile. You can use one, but you can't create one. But if you want that whole, like, I want to use one tool for, interacting with the data and for writing my database code, that is definitely a solution. I tried using the Redgate change management software, and my developers like solution files. And since there was no solution file, they were not a fan. I thought they were going to be so happy to use Management Studio with the SQL, with the change management tools, but they were not as excited as I thought they were going to be. Let's see if it's any faster. We'll give it, yep, there we go. So yeah, this one right here, you can see it no longer has the payment date as the last couple of columns. And so that's how I can tell you that the code was successfully deployed, is that we got rid of the payment date as the last column on the insert and on the value list. All right. So the goal of all of this is to manage these, what I would call process discrepancies, which are, what happened to my code? I want my code deployed. I don't know what's going on. And it's to try to get that semblance of control over it. And as you could tell from the different projects we were using, that kind of control, that kind of determines how you're going to interact with your code. Are you going to make individual script files, or are you going to, have the individual database objects? So the other parts of managing code, and this does come into play with, the new world of GitHub and all of that, is how you're doing your branching and your merging. And so branching is where you take your code and you, I'm checking for time. You take your code and you can take one, like the version of code that's in production, and you can actually apply that version of code. You can start working off of that same code base. And if you and a team member both need to work on something, you both can start with the same beginning point of the code that's in production. And you can work separately, or your team members can work separately from one another so that one person's changes don't match another. And then merging is where you're going to put all that code back together. And I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to try to click through some of these to get to the full one. There we go. All right, so you've got your two branches, and what you're going to do is that the black line in the center represents your main branch. And what you're going to do is you're going to pull the main branch down to make sure you have the most up-to-date one, and then you're going to create a branch off of main. And you do that 2 different times. We good? Question?
Nope, good.
Okay. And then for my company, what we do is we make a release branch. So we don't merge anything directly into our main branch. We merge it to a release branch so that we don't interfere with what's deployed to production. And I will tell you, all these branching and merging strategies are very different. I just saw a tweet from Steve Jones, I think yesterday, talking about if you don't merge your code often, you're doing development wrong, which probably means we're doing development wrong. But some of it depends on your business, right? My business develops everything in-house, whereas companies like Redgate are developing multiple versions of software that they need to manage differently. So we do get to have a little bit different control over that. You're going to want to merge your feature branches, and then after we're done, we merge our release branch back to our main branch. And then once again, our main branch reflects what's out in production. There's a couple different branch types. Feature branch is the one we use most, which is usually like user story based. You've got Epic, which is kind of where you can bundle a whole bunch of work together. Hotfix is how we manage hotfixes. And then as I discussed, our release branch. And this is my company's internal branching merging strategy, which looks like a lot, but my main point is you don't have to do it the way we're doing it. You need to do it the way it works for your company. You can have merge conflicts. I will say they are definitely possible on the SQL Server Data Tools state-based deployments. And they usually happen in that case because two people have created database objects in the same subfolder of the same database. There's different ways you can manage resolving them. You can tell the developers to resolve them. I usually have kind of taken that role. Just because it makes our lives easier at my company, but we're pretty small. But they're not scary. They're totally workable. You just kind of have to take a minute to understand the data. So the most important part, besides having your database and source control, is to choose a deployment method, whether you're going to use migration-based or state-based. And then after you choose your migration-based or state-based deployment, you'll want to discuss how you're going to branch and merge your code. And the key to branching and merging your code is to make sure that when you're working with your code, that you are not, if you're at risk of affecting somebody else's code, that everybody knows that, right? So when I first started, we were using TFS and everybody worked out of the same branch. So people knew they were working out of the same branch and we worked appropriately. Now, since everybody has their own branch and every team has multiple branches, it's made it easier to operate in their own silo. But it does mean that when we get ready to merge all the code, that may be when we have merge conflicts or need to kind of be more careful. But I wish you all well and hope that you all start or continue on the journey of automating your database deployment so that you can have as peaceful deployments as I generally have.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely a lot of stuff. Got some good notes down here, and definitely something I'm pretty sure I'll be emailing you about some more questions for. I've got a client I'm working with that they're looking at wanting to do this. So
it's fun. It is. I got super jealous. My developers were all using Octopus Deploy before I was. And so we were doing deployments where I was running scripts manually and they were finished deploying in like 10 minutes or less. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I want that. Mm-hmm. Why can't I have the easy deployment?
Absolutely.